Well, I pointed out a long time ago. No, I point out frequently. It was on my channel. And if anyone asked me, I just say, yeah, I told you I used to be a self-proclaimed fascist. I went through the whole political phase like a lot of people do. Before that, I was a social liberal or just someone who wasn't very interested in politics, just apolitical, and um and I didn't hold any like crazy, terrible fascist. I don't opinions. I did never elaborated upon that because I didn't believe in any of that. Right? And obviously, it's bad. But recently, I
Yeah, I
just
don't think that you do. And I mean, like I thought a lot of the same kind of shit too at one point.
well, yeah, a lot of people have a tendency to transition politically. I mean, that's something that commonly happens. Um, but I didn't hold any, I didn't hold any fascistic opinions. One of the things I believed, though, while leaving, quote unquote, the right, was that, of course, we have to curtail free speech for like the most extreme kind of fascists, in public and so on. And I remember when the controversies surrounding, say, Gab, right, or synagogue shootings and so on. And I took the side in saying, well, we need to censor that. We can't just allow white nationalists to just say, whatever. And that was the opinion I held up until a week or so ago, and then I began.
What changed your mind?
Well, I began just listening. Not like necessarily agreeing, but just listening to some of the interviews alt right people did. I remember I watched their channels, like back in the day, and took a look again, and I said, okay, let's take the most extreme thing they can do, right? Sometimes you'll be scrolling through Twitter or whatever, and you see like an alt right post. Let's say it's like a really anti-gay post. It's like, oh, uh, homosexuals spread this amount of disease. They abuse children, and then you see all these like statistics that are accompanied by these images, right? And then you even see like them linking to the statistics, and then like these are academic studies, these are real things. And I haven't taken a look at them, but I have seen a lot of refutations to that. In that, really, when you consider like AIDS viruses, right? It's only I believe it's only 0.4% of the gay population who even have AIDS. Like it's microscopic. So it's obviously like even if they were responsible for most of it, it's overblown. It's acted like it's a big deal. And there's a lot of other stuff like the parenting thing. I believe other studies have found that they're just as good as parenting. But nonetheless, right? Like if you just happen if you're like apolitical one day and you just happen to be scrolling through some studies, you find yourself in a website you didn't want to, and then you come across all these statistics, right, at face value. You then say, well, obviously, look at all these homosexuals abusing children. They're not, but you believe that,
Yeah,
right? And
sure.
yeah, that's why.
And you see you see that black people commit more violent crime or whatever,
Oh
and you
yeah,
immediately assume that that means that black people are more violent. Blah blah blah. Yeah, I'm familiar with all of this.
yeah, you do that, but it's not their fault though, because I mean, if you see something, right, and it looks like, well, there's this evidence that says this is real. I mean, if you just say, well,
Sure.
you're not allowed to say that, right? We need to ban you. It just does the opposite effect of what you want. It just kind of helps confirm
Yeah,
their
absolutely.
belief.
No, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you on that. That's 100% true, and that's a liberal facet of something that people on the left have been having to deal with for decades. I just released a video about this, like I think 2 weeks ago, talking about how the last thing that we should be doing whenever somebody makes some kind of controversial take is, jumping down their throat and making them feel like they're irredeemable. I told you the thing that I told you because I personally know, well, at least I've seen from what your videos have said and everything like that, that you are a very smart individual, and I don't think that falling for some kind of alt right statistic saying that slavery is somehow better than wage slavery or something like that is I think that you're above that. And it's not like I'm going to cancel you for it, but I definitely am not going to sit here and then say like you didn't do anything wrong because like clearly like that's just a factually inaccurate statement.
Okay, so um Well, the thing is, when it comes to disagreeing on these things, I didn't like what actually happened is I never went to somebody and shoved it down their throats. No, it was everyone that came to me and then started, creating a controversy out of something that I pointed out was controversial. I mean, the whole point of why I was even pointing these things out was because they were controversial. Not necessarily that you had to
Sure.
buy into them, but you had to think about them because obviously, if something is held in high regard for a long time, you consider it. Maybe the conceptions you brought up with aren't really true.
Well, I understand that. That's the same thing that you look at when it comes to the Soviet Union or whatever. You don't want to take anything that you hear on face value immediately. But the other thing about that too is that doesn't mean that everything is fake news and that we should think that the opposite of everything that we've been told is true, right? Like you can still look at the facts, look at the evidence, and come to the proper conclusion instead of coming to a conclusion that is wildly on the other side of things. I mean, like at one point, when I was looking through all of the information about the Soviet Union and Stalin and everything like that, I came to the conclusion, well, holy fuck, it turns out that they were the good guys all along. Well, no, it's not that. It's not that simple. It never is. There are no good guys. There never are. And we can't just immediately go from being capitalist to being Marxist Leninists because that really is not taking into consideration the power structure, dynamic, and so forth, right? Same thing goes when it comes to any one of these other conspiracy theories, which is exactly what this is a conspiracy theory. I mean, like, you're looking at statistics that were created by who, right? Talking about who? How did they get this information? Why? Was it under duress? Was it under coercion? Was it under, like, all of these different societal problems? Not even to mention, on top of all of that, that you're not taking into consideration the fact that slaves were beaten, that they were property, that they didn't have the right to vote, and so forth.
No, I'm taking into account all that. No, I've taken into account all that. In fact, I remember presenting a few arguments originally, but it wasn't meant to be that. People made it and forced me into that. But I don't blame anyone particularly because I realize the internet is a mistake. So that's just what happens when you there's so little information one person can put forth. It's not like I'm linking them to this big article. I'm just that's why it turned out to be a mess, to say the least. But I am taking
well, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, first of all, you're trying to, if that is in fact the case, that you're trying to present this very complex idea about how the left censors and the right wants to talk about free speech, but they have some things wrong, but we should actually listen to them and blah, blah, blah. And out of that comes the slavery argument. I mean, that's a fine position to take, right? But maybe the platform that you decided to take it on with, like, what is it, 150 characters on Twitter isn't necessarily conducive to having that kind of a conversation.
And you're completely right. Yeah, you're completely right. That's something I should have taken into account. Well, it's something I say I would take into account, but due to this little controversy thing, I've sort of it's given me a good time to just kind of reflect on things, and I think that was a positive in one sense because I needed to just further consider where I stand in the left. But I want to just
here's the thing, right? Is that everybody keeps having this fucking problem where they want to cancel everybody immediately because they say something that's a little bit off color or a little bit blue. I don't think that anybody should get canceled for doing stuff like that, and I think that all of this can be used as a learning experience. But the very last thing that I want to do is have two things happen, right? The first thing, have people that have notable voices like you saying things basically make it like how can I explain this? Make it seem like anarchists for some reason are like in favor of slavery, like, because who's talking about like anarchism outside of like you, me, and like Peter Cobb?
Well, yeah, they're not. It's not a big community, but it's not like I said. Chattel slavery is good.
So all anarchists believe that, then, right? That's my problem with the optics about that sort of thing. Yeah, but and like honestly, that doesn't matter to me because I mean it matters to me personally because like I feel like it could affect me personally or other people in the community personally. But really, I'm an anarchist, right? So honestly, you say whatever you want to say, do whatever you want to do. Don't toe any kind of line, and we're not trying to predict a certain group think or anything like that. I just, when I see stuff like that, I immediately think, holy fuck, that's bad, and that you probably might regret saying something like that later, because the internet does last forever, and that those kind of comments can come back and bite you in the ass. But the other thing that I don't want the left to do is to be seen as the way it's been seen for the last for so long, where anytime anybody says anything that's a little bit problematic, then they're immediately canceled and they're thrown out and nobody wants to listen to them and blah, blah, blah. Because that's basically, well, what is fueling the right now, right? People see the right as being accepting somehow and the left as being repulsive. And that's not where I want to be.
Well, I mean, the thing is that I believe both the left and the right. It's not a essentialist argument. I say that the left and the right tend, as movements, right, not as ideologies, tend to be rather homogenous in one sense or another. You know, they like their in group. They don't want to hear opinions that fall out of bounds from what they're used to, or even new takes on old opinions. So it's not like I'm coming here and I'm saying, well, I'm advocating this whole new policy. You know, we should bring back chattel slavery. I'm not saying that. No one. I never said that once. Never even. In fact, I even explicitly.
A little bit, because I can't quite hear you. Oh, hold on, Oak. So you're breaking up a lot. Just pause 1 second. Try again.
I didn't say we should. I explicitly stated we shouldn't have chattel slavery. You know, that's not the point. What I was getting at is that, you know, if you stumble across a bunch of statistics, and then also just think about it theoretically, think about what the definition of chattel slavery is, and kind of compare it. I think the only reason people think of chattel slavery as just this evil, right? Even certain capitalists, is because we've just been taught that it is. But you need to compare these systems, and I compared these things both historically and in theory, just inherent to what chattel slavery is, and it doesn't appear, and I can give you heaps of reasons if you want to have that talk, but I just said it doesn't appear that chattel slavery is near as bad as what we have now.
Yeah, and and I understand that you want to make that argument. I honestly don't see that being necessarily a sound argument, specifically for the facts that I listed earlier. The whole idea that that chattel slaves didn't have any rights whatsoever. They were literally treated like property 100% of the day instead of just like 80% of the day, whatever now. They were beaten. They had their genitals cut off. If they tried to run away, they were attacked by dogs. Like chattel slavery, especially in the United States, it was horrible. And then after that led to Jim Crow, the segregation, just people having picnics under black people swinging from trees by their necks. Like, shit got fucking real serious. And as much as I hate capitalism, at least in the West, I don't see wage slavery being as destructive as that. It is destructive in many other ways, right? You don't need to point a gun. You don't need to stab somebody to torture them to death. And that's what we're doing. We're torturing people to death. But it's not as outrightly violent and oppressive as chattel.
Well, I hear the sentiment often, yes. Let me just think for one moment. Well, look, you said that they weren't held 100% of the day. Is that the argument?
Well, that's part of the argument, sure. If we're going to talk about extremes of how terrible one terrible system is in comparison to another terrible system, I mean, we're going to have to set up some sort of metric.
Well, look, let's just measure it in that regard, right? I mean, you picked a specific point of it, so let's just talk about that. If you were a chattel slave, right, you couldn't leave the premises of wherever the plantation was, right? And even in theory, you probably couldn't get out of the confines of somebody who wants to drag you back to the workplace, right? You know, you can't really leave. Okay. But if you were to leave, I mean, where would you go? Would you find another employer? Because then you would just be in the exact same situation. And maybe you can say that, well, there's the chance that somebody will find better work or something like that. But under what we have now, the wage labor system, people sort of just have to crawl to whichever job position they can find. They can't really be too picky. If that were the case, and everyone would have nice jobs and get paid really well and all that, but that's obviously not the case. There's, in fact, it's become even more complicated employment because of contracts and, signing up and things like that. So in reality, what's the argument being presented here? I mean, a child slave can still have a house.
I can give you the argument. It's a very, very simple argument. One has small hope, right? A small amount of hope, and the other one has no hope at all. That's the argument, right? Like, if we're talking about hours of the day, you have to work for a capitalist 8, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, right? Even sometimes your free time is considered labor for a capitalist, considering that you can't scroll on Twitter without having, or on Facebook without having to see ad shit. But when you're a slave, it's literally 24 hours of the day, and you can't even leave the premises. At least here, I can, if I'm able to save up enough money, I can at least fly to Europe.
Well, obviously, you're not working 24 hours a day as a chattel slave. They don't do that. In fact, there's actually one study that said, and found, accurate study, found that chattel slaves in America worked less hours. And on top of that, were fed better than wage slaves. So it's, I mean, I know what you're saying. You're going to leave the premise, but you can still leave the premise as a chattel slave. It's not like dogs would hunt down the majority of people who ran away. And it's not like you really need to run away because because if you leave your job here, then you're out of an employer, you're unemployed, you're going to die over a long period of time as opposed to dying like immediately. So that's made the situation worse.
Now, I'm going to contest your sources on that one, saying that chattel slaves work less than people work nowadays. But you may very well be accurate on that. But that's not necessarily my problem. My problem is that you are in the control of somebody else for a longer portion of your life, as opposed to being under capitalism, where you are under the control of somebody else for, like I said, 8, 10, 12, 14 hours a day, as opposed to 24 hours a day. It doesn't, if I go home after I leave from my fucking job at Dairy Queen, if I go home and I sit down on my couch, my boss can't call me back into work. Well, I mean, like they sometimes can. It depends on what your shift is, basically, or whatever. But for the most part, you can't just get called back into work. If I'm a construction worker, I leave my job, I go home, there is no fucking chance they're calling me back into work. So, like, you're not owned.
Well, if somebody
you're rented.
Yeah, but if somebody kidnaps somebody, it could be however it's done, and take them, drag them to a construction site and force them to work for a certain amount of time, they can then leave that construction site. I mean, they can call them back eventually, but it's not like you're on the premises. You still have a house, and that's given to you automatically as a slave. Like, we have to pay rent, and people are homeless now, and that's like hundreds of millions of people. So, I mean, the global challenge.
Okay, but that still doesn't matter, because, like, if I was to try to leave while I'm living on that fucking plantation, then they kill me.
But where are you going to leave? I mean, what's the purpose in that? Do you want to just explore? Do you want to go to a different country?
Yeah, well, why would you want to leave why wouldn't you want to leave now? The same reasons that you want, and even more so, you are not having the freedom and bodily autonomy and ability to be able to go and do the things that you want to do as a free human being. Just those reasons alone are reasons enough to want to leave. You don't even need to leave to want to, or to know that you don't even need to leave to have the sense that being able to leave is a good thing.
Well, being able to leave, I mean, if somebody were to transfer to a different country, even as a chattel slave, and still work for the same company and make that person rich, they would still be owning that person. It wouldn't actually change anything. In fact, because you're bought and sold under chattel slavery, that usually just transfers you to another location, usually somewhere better, because it's a bigger business, and that's what happens. And you know, like chattel slave businesses at the time, this could be like a corporation or an industry or whatever with hundreds of thousands of slaves, you know, that they walk around. They don't live in like one tiny space. Like if somebody came up to me and they kidnapped me or did something like that, they could still. It's not like they even want to regulate every part of somebody's life. They don't have the energy or ability to do that, especially when they're away. Okay. They still have to come back to work though.
Yeah, okay, whatever. It doesn't really matter, because, like, no matter what happens, I can be locked up in the most beautiful cage you've ever seen. It's still a cage. I'd much rather be free and living in the middle of nowhere than be locked up inside and be forced to be somebody's fucking slave. That that's just, well, as far as I'm concerned, that's against anarchism, because we are for 100% bodily autonomy so long as it doesn't affect the rights and freedoms of anybody else.
Well, yeah,
So-
it's almost as though I'm not for chattel slavery. Jeez.
No, I know you're not forced chattel slavery, but we're talking about a matter of extremes here. And when we're talking about a matter of extremes, that is a far harsher extreme than capitalism. At least under capitalism, you have a chance to get out of it. Under slavery, there was no chance. It was like being a serf. There was nothing. You were born a slave, you die a slave.
Well, you can move.
At least here, sometimes fucking things like what's his name, like rock stars and shit can happen, right? Like you can win the lottery, for fuck's sake.
Well, somebody who could win the lottery as a slave, I mean, if they did that, then they could just break out of their situation. But, like, it would give you the same riches. My point is that regardless of you being physically bound to an individual, it's not going to change your overall activities. What somebody does, let's say somebody really wants to move, they move about, they change areas or whatever, they could do so as long as they still work for the profits of that one person. What we have here is that we can choose who we barely can even choose who we want to wage labor for, but we sort of get the chance, if we're lucky now and then, to choose a different master, and that person in question could be worse. We don't know. You get like the medium with chattel slavery. Somebody's not going to be at the absolute worst because it's going to balance things out this way.
Oh, that's being pretty liberal on the idea of chattel slavery. Like you're just assuming that everybody that owns slaves was a nice person.
No,
not everybody that owns slaves is a nice person.
Nobody
just like not everybody that's a capitalist is a bad person.
No one who owns slaves is a nice person. I'm saying that it depends on the individuals, obviously, and there's less deviation from the norm under chattel slavery because things are just normalized. It's not like you're going to get these slaves. So these are the people that are oppressed, right? That get all this money, all this property, right? That they're compensated with or whatever, and that's going to create some incredible economic inequality. Usually, there's no one really in poverty in chattel slavery. Like you can see poverty today under wage slavery, but the people that were in chattel slavery, they get brought up to like the average of the slave, and usually they wouldn't keep them in such bad conditions so they wouldn't continue their work. There's nothing in the definition of chattel slavery that has anything to do with not compensating people for their work.
Yeah, absolutely it does. Of course it does. They're they're property. You can treat them just like horses. You can treat your horse or your dog really nice. You can build it a really fancy, nice barn, and you can give it fucking clothes if you want. But you're still treating it like fucking property. Like my problem isn't with how good they're treating the slaves. My problem is that they have slaves to begin with. That's the major problem here.
But that's just
right?
semantics.
Slavery is worse than renting. Here. It's not semantics. It's the difference between owning somebody and renting somebody. And owning somebody is worse than renting somebody.
What if somebody's rented their entire life? They move from one person to another, and they never get any time off. I mean, even slaves would retire. They get retirement.
Of course, you get time off. You get time off every time you are out of, or every time you leave your work. And also, you do have the chance, not albeit a small one, you do have a chance to be able to start your own business and become a capitalist yourself, right? You have the ability in this system to move up that ladder, whereas in slavery and serfdom, you do not have that chance.
You don't need to move up the ladder because there's nobody that's going to be moving down the ladder. It's just according to whoever pays you, and it might even be negotiated between the slave and the slave owner. Like somebody who takes somebody and they put them, let's actually say what we would consider chattel slavery lasts like a month. Like somebody gets abducted, they get bought and sold, they're somebody's property for a month. I mean, the fact that they're going to be off, the fact that they wouldn't even move, it doesn't actually change the end result. It's just semantics, as I've said. They're still owned for that period of time.
That's not chattel slavery. That's like indentured servitude or whatever. That's when you're only a slave for a certain amount of time. That's again a different thing.
But if you're a slave all your life, then you still get time off. It's not like you have to necessarily work more hours.
Of course you get time off. The problem isn't about having time off. The problem isn't about dressing nice. The problem isn't about living inside of a fancy house or having the access to lots of land. The problem is that you're owned by another person 100% of your time. Right now, you are not. You are just simply not in the same situation as slaves were back in those days. Right now, if you want to, you can go and live off the land, and you can hunt deer and whatever, and you can fucking do that. But fucking under slavery, you could not do that.
What about penal laborers? Like, what about people in the prison that is known as prison? You know, like they have no movement.
Those are prison slaves. That's prison slavery. Yeah, absolutely. I made videos about
there's
that.
less freedom there. They can't even move around like the area that they have to. They just stuck in one room.
Yeah, absolutely. I do not contest this argument whatsoever.
Okay, but look.
But again, it's not something that is fueling our economy.
But the prison, well, it is fueling the economy.
Prison slavery become not really. I mean, it is a part of it, but it's not the largest part of it.
But the prison is just whoever extends a prison. Like a chattel slave could extend a prison to an entire country or continent. You know, while somebody who works in one area, because they can't move and they can only find one area, they live in the rural town, the only chance of survival is wage laboring to make money.
Okay.
And they stay in this one town for years or their whole life even, you know, and they can't get out of it because they don't want to be homeless or completely broke or dead, you know? So it depends on the individual circumstances.
So, like, here's the thing. I really don't know how else to explain this. When it comes to the prison slavery thing, that is, even though it's a large percentage of people that are in prison, it is still in comparison a very small amount of people when you compare it to the rest of the labor force that is producing for the economy. Right? When we're talking about slavery, that and I'm not contesting that isn't slavery. It is 100% slavery, absolutely. But this is a different. I'm talking about capitalism as a whole, as its system is somewhat better than slavery. It still sucks. It's like comparing fucking shit to bird shit, but capitalism is just slightly better than fucking slavery. And that's bore out in the evidence. I mean, like, you don't get shot if you try to leave your house. You're able to go fucking run the streets as long as you want to. There's no problem there. You aren't owned by anybody 24 hours a day.
This is precisely why chattel slavery is a less terrible system for the very reason you gave. Someone who leaves the workplace, right, which they technically have the right to under wage labor, right? They'll die over a long period of time. It could be from dehydration, starvation, or just living in complete poverty, completely homeless, completely miserable. And on top of that, you're taking
I'm a fucking slave owner. A slave owner can do that to a slave too, and they've done it lots of times. They can throw you inside of the hole and not give you any fucking water or fucking food or anything like that.
Well, they do that, yeah. Well, then chattel slavery is worse if they do that. But I'm talking about, like, that's a microscopic percentage of all that, and you really have to do something to even warrant that. Not as though that's justified, but you have to. It builds up anyway. So
okay.
So that doesn't say anything. Somebody who leaves their position just to find a new master or never find anyone or whatever, it leads to just like a miserable life. If that were the case, we could all just leave and we could all just go work for the least terrible employers or whatever. But we can't, and we have no idea how to do that. What somebody who was a chattel slave, right? Even if they can't leave, even if they physically can't leave. Usually they still have the freedom to explore the areas they want, as long as they just come back and they do the work that's necessary. That's all a chattel slave owner wants. If they want to regulate every part of somebody's life, they usually don't, because it costs energy and people and soldiers and police, and they don't do that, and there wouldn't be any incentive for them to do that.
No, that's just some bullshit right there. Like, they definitely were stopping people from doing things, and you can do that very easily. If all of them have the guns, then people are more likely to not do bad things. That's like saying that the police state right now, because there's more population, that the population could just go and run amok and do whatever they wanted to. It's not like anybody's going to stop them. There's more. It doesn't matter if there's more. There's still the idea that if you try to get out there and you do anything, that the fucking police will come down and they will kill your ass.
Yeah, but, I mean, like, let's just say, like, how we're talking about the chattel slavery in America, right? We're talking about ending in the 1860s. So how would they even identify you if you ran away? And there's like these big fields and you can run away.
Okay, that's not even that's hilarious because okay, first of all, you could take photographs in those days. Also, Romans were keeping immaculate records of people all the way back 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So there's no way that you can make that argument. Of course, they could be able to find exactly who those people were.
Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of worth it in that regard, because they usually will just bring you back as opposed to killing you, because they'll lose money that way. I mean, look, let's say,
Sure.
for example, if I buy something, right? No, this is like a sociological thing. If I buy something, like a book, right, I'm more likely to read it because I've spent money on it. You know, if I don't buy and I get it for free, I'm less likely to read it. This is the same with college. This is the same with just, like, basic monetary investments. If you spend money on something, you're going to try and use it. You're going to try your best.
I guess, yeah.
So
if you put effort into something, then yeah, you're gonna want to get out of it something for sure.
Yeah, and you buy and sell somebody, then if you hit that person or you make them unable to work or you give them worse conditions than somebody who is a wage laborer, right? They weren't bought and sold and they went to the employer themselves, then you're getting a bad deal. And basically you would want to be bought so that person takes care of you better and doesn't allow you to die as easily. Like, what do you think? You think how many people die of starvation every year?
That sounds like a Jordan Peterson argument, man. Like, seriously, the whole thing is that okay. You know what? Finish your argument. Go ahead.
It's like, how many people die of starvation every year? I think it's like 11 million, whatever it is. The amount of people who die from water privatization, starvation, pollution, so on. That's all because the living standards were kept so low by a wage laborer to the point where they couldn't afford these things to survive. And if you were a slave, they wouldn't do that because then you wouldn't continue laboring for them, but also because they wouldn't do that because nobody is that poor under chattel slavery. It brings things up to a medium, an average. Like, you're not going to see any incredibly wealthy heaps, very compensated chattel slaves, but you're not going to see anybody at the very bottom. And generally, equality, when it comes to economics, it evens out. It's better for most people this way.
Okay, so like I reject that, and like I was saying, this is like a Jordan Peterson argument. He literally said in the argument that he was having with Slavoj Zizek that employers are not incentivized to exploit their workers, because if they exploited their workers, then those workers would just go to another place, and they would and it would be better for them to just go to a different business and blah blah blah. Right? It's the exact same argument here. Of course, the slave owners had no reason to take care of their slaves if they didn't have to. There were also different levels of slave owners. There were poorer slave owners, there were violent slave owners, there were richer slave owners, the government owned slaves. Everybody had different ways that they treated their slaves, right? So, and the fact is that they didn't have any choice whatsoever on where they were going. So, of course, they were going to end up in some situations where they're going to be beaten worse than if they were at a different plantation. But it's still like now. Some dog owners will beat the shit out of their dogs. There's less of them, but it's still, the dogs are still property.
Well, the dogs are, you could say that they're property, but anyone who is currently controlling somebody controls them as property. Like, for example, someone who is forced into marriage, like a young girl or whatever, she is owned as property. Is that not objectively true?
No, I don't think sorry, a girl that's forced into marriage? Yeah, I suppose that she is being treated like property, yeah.
What if she consented to be in marriage, and thus once she consented, she couldn't leave? Would she be property then?
Yeah, well, no, I already agreed that, yeah, if you force somebody into marriage, then yes, they are definitely being treated as property, yeah.
But I rephrased it. I said they weren't originally forced, but once they were married, which they agreed to, they then cannot leave the marriage.
Okay, so that is kind of a difficult situation because you're starting off with something that was like a consenting agreement, but like I do follow your like logic here. So I've never really thought about that before, about marriage possibly being like related to a contract to owning somebody. But that is, you know what, you can make a fair argument to that. I'm not gonna outright say that it's necessarily wrong.
Well, if you had one child bride, that person's likely going to try and take care of her. Now, it's bad that he owns her as what I would consider property, because he does have authority over her. She cannot leave, but he's going to be incentivized to try and keep that relationship together. A slave owner, because he buys and sells people, they take the money and so on. They have incentive to do things. When it comes to renting people, it's not like you pay them this amount. I mean, really, if you're talking about compensation, if we took a look at all the property that chattel slaves accumulated from the work, we can measure that in dollars, and we can say, well, that chattel slaves tended to be wealthier than the general population, and there was no people in the extreme absolute poverty. It evened itself out. Mm-hmm. There's these incentives for slave owners to do these things. So generally, an employer they can toss their employees aside, they can treat them absolutely terrible. They're always going to have a supply of labor to keep things going.
Okay, you know what? I'd have to say that that's probably the strongest argument that you made so far. And I don't necessarily disagree with you on 100% of that, right? For sure. I suppose that if somebody does pay for something, they are going to treat it a little bit better. But also at the same time, we're talking about... I think the problem is that we're coming at this in different levels, right? You're coming at it saying basically that this is better because their standard of living is better. And I'm looking at it and thinking, no, this is not better because they don't have freedom, right? And I think that that's basically why we're having this kind of disconnect. Because, yeah, if you want to look at it on the grounds of, if you want to make that the deciding factor, was their standard of living better than the poorest of the poor now? Arguably. You could say possibly in some situations that it was. Possibly. Right? That is laden with millions of caveats, right? But it is feasibly possible. But it doesn't really matter because the argument that I have against it doesn't have to do with how good they're doing. It's the same reason why I don't care about liberal democratic socialism, right? Or, social democracy. Social democrats want to make capitalism a little bit easier to deal with, a little bit fuzzier, a little bit nicer, right? But all they're doing is just basically bandaging the system, making our standard of living a little bit better under a completely damaging, destructive system. That's the same problem that I have with slavery.
I understand your argument here. But let me give you an historical example, right? A big one. In America, during the times of chattel slavery, you had these African Americans who were usually genetically related to one another. They were usually in big families, but not exclusively, who would often buy and sell one another. We're talking about in America, right? They would go to people who were owned as chattel slaves, and they would buy their freedom, right? But they wouldn't give them freedom. They would just own them. So you could have a bunch of African American chattel slaves working the fields. One day, they'd be purchased by other African Americans. Now, they still have authority over them, right? They can do exactly what they want with them, right? They can do whatever. Mm-hmm. However, what they didn't do is abuse them or use that authority in any way. They didn't, exercise the whip over them. No, they did it. They actually bought them to give them, a decent quality of life because they could provide them. Yeah. They were friends, in other words. They were looking for each other. And they still technically owned them. They had the same property rights over them, but they didn't do anything with that. It's just semantics if it's not actually exercised.
I hear you, right? But I completely disagree. That's the same kind of argument that they made when they expanded the drone program and expanded the things that Obama could do, that President Obama could do back when they were instituting the Patriot Act, right? They said, "Oh, don't worry, they're expanding all of these legislations. They're taking away more of your freedom, but it's okay because the guy that's doing it is a really nice guy." And he probably won't abuse it. But that doesn't change anything because the next person that comes in or the next slave owner, even like you just said, will come in and they will abuse those people. It's a matter of ownership, right? It's not a matter of how well they're doing under that ownership. It's a matter of that they're being owned.
Well, we're technically 100% of the time owned by the state, the monopoly on control, the thing that owns every single person in the world. So again, we could live under a state. There could be an organization that says, "Oh yeah, I own these people. You're my property," but do they do anything with it? Well, I guess we shouldn't allow them in that position. But nonetheless, it's not like it's going to change our standard of living or our happiness or our even acknowledgement of them. Maybe one day we'll forget they even exist. It just depends on the government. It depends on the people that own other people.
You're preaching to the choir when you're saying that we're owned by the state. I mean, I totally agree that we are owned by the state, but it's a matter of severity at that point, right? And that's where I come in and I say that's basically a difference of like, yeah, so we are owned technically by the state, and it is like domineering force or whatever. But at the same time, you can still walk outside and walk down the street and not get stopped and thrown inside the back of the truck and carted back to your house. Again, it's not much more freedom, but it is more freedom. And also at the same time, it's not a direct violent act against you. You aren't being beaten, having your genitals cut off, being thrown inside of a fucking hot box, all of these sorts of things. You are being starved to death, though. So, like, I'm not going to deny the fucking problems of capitalism, and I'm not going to sit here defending it either. But
Well, it depends on how
I think that we might have to. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
No, what were you saying?
I was going to say we might have to agree to disagree on this one because, like, I understand why you're saying that you think that it's better. I don't agree with your arguments, right? Like, I don't think that they're I don't think that they're good. But like, I understand why you're saying them. It's just that like it's a degree of like we are being owned right now less than we were being owned. Not us, actually. Me and you're an Australian and I'm from fucking Canada, and we're talking about Americans, Black Americans. But Black Americans were being owned in the South like 100% of their day. They were basically the same thing as horses.
Well, in one sense, yeah, I mean, you own a horse as property, but when you're bought and sold, when a child is bought and sold from an orphanage, right, and they're handed to their parents, and their parents can allow them to leave their house or whatever, and it's the same with prisons, actual prisons, right, in the literal sense, you're not allowed to leave a prison, you have one room. Both of these situations are, in a sense, more oppressive. You have even less space, even less control over yourself. While a chattel slave, they get to work, they get to, they can even sell. They can even make money by selling the stuff they're compensated with. And they get shelter and all these things. And I'm saying, even though nobody should have authority over anyone, so chattel slavery is still bad, when I compare it to this system, I just see semantics coming out of the argument in favor of being...
You know what? I think that I just realized something too. When you're talking about that, you keep bringing up prison, and you keep bringing up children, and you keep bringing up these things. And marriage and so forth, those things still existed under slavery too, right? The major defining factor that we're talking about here is the difference between owning and renting a person. And all of those other things, marriage still existed, all of those other things that I just mentioned, they all still existed under slavery.
Well, historic slavery and both theoretical slavery would just have one person owning someone. So, for example, school, which, you're forced to go to, or else the police will... is pulling you to a classroom or a workplace or whatever. You don't have to do that when you're a chattel slave. You had the option of child labor, which wasn't good, but at the same time, you're still kind of forced to do something. So you're best off getting compensated for it. Well, you don't get compensated in school. So in reality, I mean, that's something that didn't exist historically with chattel slaves, and it's something that wouldn't exist. I mean, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay for that? No one. No one's going to pay for somebody's school tuition. Not even primary.
No, nobody's paying for the slaves to go to school. No, they're already under a different set of circumstances. But sometimes they actually did get taught all kinds of things like how to read and so forth. But it was disincentivized because having having masses that can read and write and stuff like that makes them harder to control. But that didn't mean that there wasn't still schooling. Schooling has existed, again, since long before the Roman times, right? Like, they still had school.
Well, I mean
kids went to school. White kids went to
schooling,
school.
Though. I mean, compulsory. I mean, if a child, decides to go to school, all right, well, that's a voluntary decision. So that's something anarchists...
It's not the children deciding to go to school. It's the fucking parents deciding that they're going to school.
That wasn't the case under chattel slavery,
though. It's not like all of a sudden kids had autonomy back in those days. They had less autonomy, if anything.
But if you let's say you lived in Great Britain in like the 1840s, since they had the compulsory schooling acts, I believe that was the case. I could be wrong, but I believe in the 1840s you were forced to go to school. And of course that was public education. You still had to go to school and you still had to work, and you'd be working something like 12 or 14 hours a day, even as a kid, and you'd be performing horrible work in industrial, like terrible painful conditions, right? And you still have to go
Yeah.
to school and fulfill the same hours. As someone who's a chattel slave, they won't rip the time they could be spent laboring for, the chattel slave owner so they could go to school. Anything else outside of labor is just free time for them. So that's something that's obviously already out of the way.
Well, but we have a lot of free time now. Like again, like it's all boiling down. We have all of the exact same things minus the slavery bit. Like everything else is still the same, but we had slaves then. So, like you say that all of the arguments that are coming out of this side are semantic. I mean, like literally all of the arguments that are coming out of your side just honestly seem like you're trying to apologize for or somehow say that slavery is better than. I don't see how. Like, literally all of these things still existed.
No, but you weren't forced to go to school. You know that, right? As a chattel slave, you weren't forced to do that, and it wouldn't make any sense.
No, not as a chattel slave. No, but all of the white kids and all of the people that weren't slaves, they all went to school.
Well, of course, I'm against forced schooling. I mean, I think it should be an option, if you need to learn things. But I'm saying...
Okay, sure.
But I'm saying, if you work less, and I can even pull up the statistic if you want. I can do it after this if you want, and I'll show you. Yeah, chattel slaves worked less hours overall, and you didn't have to go to school, and you were compensated for your time working, right? Mostly not in money, but you could still trade and buy and sell the things you were given to make money. That's what they historically actually did. And on top of you would get something out of that. While a lot of the time in school, if it's not for a job you were prepared for, and you could easily do that voluntarily. It's just a better system this way. It's still bad because somebody owns you, right? And that shouldn't be the case. You should be able to own yourself, but we're all owned by the state.
Fuck, man. Nah, dude, it is not a better system. Like, it clearly wasn't a better system. There was literally all of the same oppression that we have now. There was maybe not compulsory schooling for the little slave children, but for all of the other children, they had to go to school. You're
they
absolutely
weren't chattel
fucking
slaves.
right.
They weren't chattel slaves though. But those of you weren't chattel slaves. So
what does that matter? What does that matter? The slaves, the rest of the population still had to go to school. So they were still sitting under the same oppression. The chattel slaves, whether or not they had to go to school or not, that doesn't matter because, like I literally just said, it was incentivized for them not to get an education. Like, you're assuming that somehow going to school is always bad all of the time. Okay, so a little bit of compulsory schooling is bad, sure. Forcing people to do things that they don't want is bad, sure. But don't you think that not teaching anybody anything or giving them an education at all is much worse? Or what? Giving them an education on something that is completely counter to reality, which was very much the case.
Yeah, but a lot of the time it's for finding jobs in the real world, and you're kind of guaranteed that under chattel slavery, and it's agricultural work, so anyone can do it. I mean, the whole purpose of chattel slavery is that you would give some people a job based upon what everyone could do, so there wouldn't be any necessity for that higher education. That's something you could always learn in your own time. You always had a roof, you always had a shelter, you didn't pay rent, so nobody was evicted. There's all these benefits that people did not have to suffer under chattel slavery. And if we go back to chattel slavery in the ancient world, like ancient Greece or ancient anywhere like that, like in Europe, the same things applied. Certain historians have even said that the conditions slaves faced weren't as bad as the ones that other people, who weren't even wage laborers, by the way, which is interesting, but I'll have to look into that. I don't think it's as it sounds, faced. So, no, they didn't have to face the same things. And it was much easier working in agriculture, working in something that everyone could do, right? And getting compensated for that, than working in workplaces and industrial conditions and factories and so on, where there was a high chance of you getting injured and dying from workplace fatalities, are also just more unbearable to do.
Okay, so you're taking a stance on this as though, like, literally the only capitalist like there are different levels of fucking horrible conditions for both slavery and for people under capitalism, right? For me, under capitalism in Canada, I'm fucking a lot better off than people that are in a capitalist system like I don't know, Saudi Arabia or something like that. The same thing goes for people that were owned as slaves in different places. And also, you're assuming that all of the statistics that you're pulling up are even correct. How do you even know that those are correct? They were written by the people that were literally owning other that
No,
were
they weren't
literally
written by
owning
those. They
people.
weren't written by anyone who owned slaves. No, these are historians in the present who are looking back at this and collecting data that was available.
Oh, okay. Well, you can send me the you can send me the information. I'll take a look at it.
Okay, I can do it after the stream then. But as I was saying,
Yeah.
you know,
So
This is an interesting thing to join into.
who's this? Oh, hey, how's it going?
Pretty good. Finished an art thing. I finished an art thing
Oh, okay, cool.
as I posted in the art channel.
Oh,
And
okay,
pretty much
excellent.
every server I had that has an art channel, because I'm actually pretty proud of it. Did some new shading techniques, added a background to my freaking things for once that isn't an abstract color or gradient.
Very nice. That's fantastic. Anyway, so yeah, no, like again, visionary. I'm afraid like we're gonna have to sit here and agree to disagree, man. Like as far as I'm concerned, I would try not to. If you want to go and say those kinds of things on Twitter again, I mean, like fucking feel free, do whatever you want. But I would definitely look into some more statistics on that shit because that and. Ugh, I don't know, man. I just can't agree with you.
no, I understand
So
why you don't have to. I'm not forcing anybody to fucking agree with me. No, no,
All
but I'm just-
right, buddy. Like I said, I'm not like I don't want to cancel anybody over anything. I like, but yeah, like also take into consideration like all of that shit. Just take a look at it and think about it. That's what I have to say. And I always have to daddy people. I always have to be like the one that says wear your fucking helmet, blah blah blah. So try to
Okay.
take care.
all right. Well, you take care. Thanks for talking, man.
All right. You too,
I
buddy.
saw
Bye.
I saw your video on the recession that might happen, and all I'm
Okay.
thinking is, okay, so while the economy is shit and the military isn't using our tax dollars, let's like milkshake, egg, and soak as many fascists as possible, and cops and stuff. Meanwhile, let's just unionize everything while they're distracted with us. And they'll be like,
Oh.
and then they'll turn around and be like, "Oh, okay, the government's gone."
I like that. I think that's a fabulous distraction.
Yeah, it's freaking. How are we losing to these people? They have eggs, and we have freaking pistols.
It'll work. I'm positive it'll work.
I saw a video on r/complete anarchy. It's just everyone in like a neighborhood soaking like having super soakers and stuff, just like soaking a cop in his car and stuff.
Hopefully with milkshake.
Well,
I said, was it with milkshakes or what?
it was just water, super soakers,
Oh,
squirt guns.
oh,
you
fuck,
know.
that's awesome. Cool.
I could probably find it the post and put it here.
All right, like I gotta take off, guys. But thank you very much for giving me a chat, buddy.
Yeah.
All right, man. You take care.
All
You're
right.
doing good.
Yeah, later, dude. Bye.
All right, I'm gonna log
Freaking
out, I believe.
freaking milkshakes. Okay. Okay, yeah.
You take care.
Yeah.